The haunted autumn of 1834 brought unprecedented spiritual disruption to the Missouri-Oklahoma borderlands as Cherokee Nation families faced forced removal along the Trail of Tears, while territorial boundaries became contested wilderness, whose abandonment created optimal conditions for ancient spiritual forces to assert claims over sacred sites that had been systematically violated through westward expansion policies whose implementation ignored indigenous territorial sovereignty. Thomas Weatherby's establishment of Pioneer Homestead along the remote 4-mile road that would become infamous as the Devil's Promenade occurred simultaneously with Cherokee displacement, whose spiritual consequences exceeded normal territorial transfer to encompass supernatural awakening of protective forces, whose corruption would transform them from guardians into vengeful dynasty destroyers. The 43-year-old Thomas Weatherby's frontier experience provided comprehensive understanding of normal wilderness dangers, while his pioneer determination to establish permanent settlement ignored Cherokee elder warnings about spiritual territorial boundaries, whose violation required appropriate acknowledgement and respectful coexistence protocols that his European cultural background did not recognize as legitimate. His homestead location selection prioritized practical considerations, including water access and defensive positioning, while remaining ignorant of spiritual geography, whose recognition demanded integration of indigenous knowledge systems and traditional territorial understanding that exceeded contemporary pioneer cultural frameworks. Running Bear's Cherokee spiritual authority provided crucial understanding of territorial guardian spirits, whose protective function included maintaining sacred site integrity, while his 61 years of traditional knowledge encompassed awareness of supernatural consequences for sacred ground desecration that exceeded normal environmental concerns through otherworldly rather than purely material. Territorial claims. His final ceremonial activities before forced relocation included appropriate spiritual protocols for territorial transfer, whose violation might awaken ancient forces that had remained dormant through respectful indigenous territorial management, and spiritual oversight that European settlement patterns systematically ignored. The initial supernatural manifestations that characterized spiritual awakening included systematic environmental disturbances whose characteristics exceeded normal seasonal variations, while atmospheric phenomena demonstrated otherworldly influence over regional conditions that suggested intelligent rather than random supernatural activity. The manifestations included electromagnetic atmospheric disturbances and wildlife behavior modifications, while environmental omens created evidence of supernatural territorial assertion that challenged European cultural assumptions about appropriate land use and territorial sovereignty, whose acknowledgement required integration of indigenous spiritual knowledge systems. The intelligent glowing orb that emerged as primary supernatural manifestation demonstrated predatory cunning and psychological sophistication whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual activity through systematic study of human behavior patterns and strategic exploitation of individual psychological vulnerabilities for optimal supernatural manipulation and territorial assertion. The entity's behavior suggested otherworldly intelligence, whose tactical capabilities enabled personalized supernatural warfare against specific family bloodlines, whose targeting criteria remained initially unclear but increasingly systematic through ongoing supernatural encounters that revealed strategic rather than random predatory activity. The Weatherby family's psychological exploitation that characterized supernatural entity tactics included systematic deployment of deceased relative manifestations, whose emotional effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual communication through intimate knowledge of family history and individual grief patterns that enabled optimal manipulation of parental instincts and religious faith. The entity demonstrated comprehensive understanding of family dynamics while utilizing specific psychological vulnerabilities to create irresistible supernatural traps whose success enabled ongoing territorial assertion and human elimination through strategic rather than random predatory targeting whose effectiveness transcended individual encounters. The personalized supernatural traps that entity intelligence created included manifestations tailored to individual family member psychology, while Thomas experienced deceased father apparitions designed to exploit paternal authority relationships and masculine duty obligations that might encourage dangerous wilderness exploration. The traps included religious symbol manifestations for his wife's Christian faith exploitation, while phantom children sounds targeted parental protective instincts through calculated psychological manipulation, whose effectiveness enabled systematic family vulnerability, exploitation, and supernatural territorial control establishment, whose success required comprehensive human psychology. Understanding the territorial desecration consequences that Running Bear's warnings revealed included systematic explanation of spiritual territorial boundaries whose violation required appropriate acknowledgement and restitution, while European settlement patterns had systematically ignored indigenous spiritual sovereignty over sacred sites whose protection demanded ongoing, respectful relationship maintenance. The consequences included supernatural awakening of protective forces, whose corruption through territorial violation transformed traditional guardian function into vengeful dynasty elimination, whose targeting criteria included direct participation in sacred site desecration and territorial sovereignty, violation through settlement activities that ignored spiritual territorial claims. The Cherokee burial ground significance that characterized supernatural manifestation location included sacred site whose spiritual authority exceeded normal territorial claims through ancestral connection and ceremonial importance that required ongoing respectful acknowledgement and appropriate protective maintenance. The burial ground violation through homestead construction created optimal conditions for spiritual territorial assertion, while ancient protective forces responded to systematic desecration through awakening and corruption that transformed traditional guardian function into supernatural predatory activity whose targeting included direct participants in territorial violation and sacred site. Destruction through settlement expansion and territorial claiming activities. The supernatural intelligence demonstration that characterized advancing entity capabilities included systematic behavioral adaptation and strategic learning, whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual manifestation through conscious study of human psychology and tactical modification based on family response patterns. The intelligence enabled optimal supernatural trap creation, while entity learning capabilities facilitated ongoing tactical refinement, whose success enabled enhanced psychological manipulation and territorial assertion through personalized supernatural warfare, whose sophistication transcended random predatory activity through strategic rather than instinctual supernatural targeting. The family vulnerability analysis that supernatural entity conducted included systematic assessment of individual psychological weaknesses and collective family dynamics, whose exploitation enabled optimal manipulation strategy development through intimate knowledge of personal history and emotional trauma patterns. The analysis enabled personalized supernatural trap creation, while entity understanding of human psychology facilitated strategic vulnerability exploitation, whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual communication through calculated rather than accidental psychological manipulation techniques, whose success enabled systematic family destruction and territorial assertion. The escalating supernatural encounters that characterized advancing territorial assertion included systematic increase in manifestation intensity and psychological sophistication, while entity capabilities demonstrated ongoing tactical refinement and strategic adaptation to human defensive responses. The escalation created recognition that supernatural threat exceeded individual encounter significance through systematic family targeting and multi-generational persecution patterns whose scope suggested dynasty-level strategic objectives rather than purely individual predatory satisfaction through territorial assertion and human elimination whose persistence would transcend individual family. Destruction. The historical context that provided optimal conditions for supernatural awakening included systematic disruption of traditional spiritual territorial management through Cherokee forced removal, while territorial abandonment created conditions where ancient protective forces lacked appropriate indigenous spiritual oversight and respectful relationship maintenance. The context included massive cultural trauma and spiritual desecration, whose cumulative effects exceeded normal environmental disruption through systematic violation of spiritual territorial sovereignty, whose consequences included supernatural corruption of protective forces into vengeful dynasty eliminators, whose targeting criteria encompassed direct participants in territorial violation and cultural destruction. The frontier isolation that characterized Weatherby Homestead location provided optimal conditions for supernatural territorial assertion, while geographic remoteness eliminated normal community protective mechanisms and mutual defensive support that might otherwise enable resistance against otherworldly threats. The isolation created vulnerability, while supernatural entity exploitation of territorial abandonment enabled comprehensive psychological manipulation whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual encounter through strategic rather than accidental targeting of specific family bloodlines, whose elimination served territorial assertion and spiritual revenge objectives. The spiritual awakening recognition that Running Bear's warnings provided included systematic understanding of supernatural territorial claims whose legitimacy exceeded European cultural recognition, while indigenous spiritual authority offered appropriate explanatory framework for otherworldly phenomena affecting regional territorial conditions. The recognition included traditional knowledge about spiritual territorial sovereignty, while Cherokee understanding of sacred site protection requirements enabled identification of appropriate protocols for preventing supernatural corruption, whose implementation required respectful acknowledgement of indigenous territorial authority and spiritual sovereignty over sacred ground, whose violation justified supernatural territorial assertion and human elimination. As Thomas Weatherby established Pioneer Homestead upon Cherokee sacred burial ground, while systematic territorial violation awakened ancient protective forces whose corruption transformed traditional guardian function into vengeful supernatural predation against specific family bloodlines. The intelligent glowing entity that emerged along Devil's Promenade Road demonstrated sophisticated psychological warfare capabilities whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual manifestation through strategic rather than random targeting of pioneer families whose participation in territorial desecration and sacred site violation created optimal conditions for multi-generational supernatural persecution, whose scope would transcend individual encounters to encompass comprehensive dynasty elimination through systematic bloodline targeting and personalized psychological manipulation designed to exploit specific family vulnerabilities. The systematic expansion of supernatural territorial assertion that characterized entity evolution during 1835-1840 period included coordinated attacks against multiple interconnected pioneer family bloodlines, whose targeting demonstrated otherworldly intelligence and strategic planning capabilities that exceeded individual predatory activity through comprehensive dynasty-level elimination. Objectives whose scope transcended random supernatural encounters. Dr. Ezekiel Morrison's medical documentation of unusual deaths and disappearances revealed statistical patterns whose impossibility exceeded coincidental explanation, while his 39 years of frontier medical experience provided professional framework for recognizing supernatural rather than natural causation affecting multiple family lines, whose persecution characteristics suggested coordinated, otherworldly intelligence rather than individual spiritual manifestation. The 7 distinct pioneer families that became systematically targeted through supernatural persecution included bloodlines whose settlement activities shared specific characteristics that connected their territorial occupation to Cherokee sacred site desecration and traditional spiritual territorial violation through direct participation in burial ground disruption and commercial exploitation of dispossessed indigenous territories. The families included merchants who profited from Indian removal policies, while others participated directly in sacred site excavation and territorial claiming activities whose spiritual consequences exceeded normal environmental disruption through systematic violation of indigenous territorial sovereignty and spiritual protection requirements, whose maintenance demanded ongoing respectful acknowledgement. The Branham family's supernatural persecution that demonstrated entity tactical sophistication included manifestations of their recently deceased patriarch, whose appearance enabled psychological manipulation through paternal authority exploitation, while supernatural entity knowledge of family financial difficulties created irresistible offers of hidden treasure whose pursuit led victims into dangerous cave systems. The persecution included systematic exploitation of family economic desperation, while supernatural manifestations promised immediate relief from material hardship whose acceptance required following deceased relative guidance into wilderness locations, whose remoteness enabled optimal supernatural predation through psychological manipulation and territorial isolation. The McClure family, targeting that revealed entity adaptability to religious psychology, included manifestations of angelic beings and divine visions, whose spiritual authority exploited Presbyterian faith commitment, while supernatural entity understanding of theological doctrine enabled creation of convincing religious experiences that encouraged dangerous wilderness pilgrimage. The targeting demonstrated entity capability for theological sophistication, while religious manifestation authenticity exceeded normal spiritual communication through detailed scriptural reference and doctrinal accuracy, whose effectiveness enabled successful manipulation of devout family members whose faith-based vulnerability created optimal conditions for supernatural elimination through religious rather than secular psychological exploitation. The Garrett family persecution that characterized entity psychological warfare included systematic exploitation of maternal grief through phantom children manifestations whose emotional effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual communication, while supernatural entity intimate knowledge of family tragedy enabled creation of irresistible rescue scenarios. The persecution targeted parental protective instincts, while manifestations of lost children created psychological compulsion, whose resistance proved virtually impossible through maternal emotional vulnerability, whose exploitation enabled systematic family elimination through calculated rather than accidental psychological manipulation techniques, whose success demonstrated entity sophisticated understanding of human parental psychology and grief response patterns. The cave system utilization that enabled systematic victim processing included network of limestone caverns, whose modification demonstrated supernatural engineering capabilities, while victim remains revealed evidence of ritualistic rather than random elimination patterns whose organization suggested otherworldly intelligence and ceremonial objectives that exceeded normal predatory satisfaction. The cave systems included architectural modifications and victim arrangement patterns, while bone evidence revealed systematic processing, whose characteristics suggested spiritual rather than nutritional consumption, whose purposes transcended physical predation through supernatural territorial assertion and spiritual energy accumulation, whose success enabled ongoing entity capability enhancement. The Holloway family elimination that demonstrated entity multi-generational targeting included persecution spanning 3 generations, whose systematic nature revealed supernatural memory capabilities and strategic planning that exceeded normal spiritual manifestation duration through otherworldly, rather than purely temporal intelligence preservation. The elimination included coordination across geographical distances, while entity ability to track bloodline descendants suggested supernatural reconnaissance capabilities whose effectiveness transcended normal territorial limitations through otherworldly rather than purely physical surveillance, and targeting systems whose sophistication exceeded contemporary human understanding of supernatural entity operational capabilities. The Patterson family targeting that revealed entity adaptive learning included modification of supernatural tactics based on family defensive responses, while psychological warfare evolution demonstrated strategic intelligence and tactical flexibility, whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual encounter patterns through conscious rather than instinctual supernatural behavioral modification. The targeting included systematic countermeasure development against religious protective techniques, while entity tactical adaptation enabled circumvention of traditional spiritual defensive measures, whose inadequacy revealed need for innovative rather than conventional protective approaches, whose development required understanding of supernatural entity intelligence and strategic capabilities. The Whitfield family persecution that characterized entity psychological sophistication included exploitation of family historical guilt regarding Cherokee displacement participation, while supernatural manifestations referenced specific details about Indian Removal Act implementation and territorial dispossession activities whose accuracy exceeded normal spiritual knowledge. The persecution included systematic deployment of Cherokee spiritual imagery and ceremonial references, while entity understanding of cultural genocide consequences enabled optimal guilt exploitation, whose effectiveness created psychological vulnerability that facilitated supernatural elimination through ancestral responsibility acknowledgement and inherited trauma exploitation, whose success demonstrated supernatural understanding of historical injustice and intergenerational psychological impact. The coordinated attack timing that revealed entity strategic coordination included simultaneous manifestations across multiple family locations, while supernatural synchronization exceeded normal spiritual encounter patterns through intelligent rather than coincidental tactical deployment, whose effectiveness suggested central command and control capabilities that transcended individual entity. Limitations. The coordination included real-time tactical adaptation, while entity ability to maintain simultaneous operations demonstrated supernatural communication and strategic planning, whose sophistication exceeded normal spiritual manifestation through otherworldly rather than purely individual intelligence, whose organizational capabilities enabled comprehensive dynasty-level elimination campaigns. The territorial expansion evidence that characterized entity operational development included systematic claiming of additional geographical areas, while supernatural influence exceeded original Devil's Promenade location to encompass broader regional territorial control, whose scope suggested strategic rather than opportunistic expansion patterns. The expansion demonstrated long-term strategic planning, while entity territorial objectives included comprehensive regional control, whose achievement required systematic elimination of pioneer settlement, and territorial claiming activities, whose success would restore pre-European spiritual territorial conditions and indigenous sovereignty over sacred sites, whose protection demanded ongoing supernatural vigilance and territorial assertion. The supernatural learning demonstration that entity tactical evolution revealed included systematic modification of psychological warfare techniques based on family response patterns, while behavioral adaptation exceeded normal spiritual manifestation through conscious rather than instinctual capability enhancement, whose effectiveness enabled optimal victim manipulation and territorial assertion. The learning included countermeasure development against human defensive techniques, while entity intelligence enabled strategic refinement, whose success facilitated enhanced psychological manipulation and supernatural territorial control, whose effectiveness exceeded original manifestation capabilities through ongoing tactical development and strategic capability enhancement. The victim arrangement patterns that cave system evidence revealed included systematic skeletal positioning, whose ceremonial significance exceeded random predatory behavior through otherworldly rather than purely nutritional consumption objectives, whose purposes included spiritual energy accumulation and territorial assertion rather than simple physical elimination. The arrangements demonstrated supernatural intelligence, while victim processing characteristics suggested ritualistic objectives whose fulfillment enabled entity capability enhancement and territorial control expansion, whose success required systematic rather than random human elimination through calculated spiritual consumption, whose effectiveness exceeded normal predatory satisfaction. The family interconnection analysis that Dr. Morrison's documentation revealed included systematic targeting of bloodlines, whose settlement activities shared participation in Cherokee territorial dispossession and sacred site violation, whose spiritual consequences created optimal conditions for supernatural persecution through inherited guilt and ancestral responsibility for cultural genocide participation. The interconnection included shared economic interests in Indian removal policies, while family territorial claiming activities violated specific sacred sites whose spiritual protection required ongoing indigenous oversight and respectful territorial management, whose absence created conditions for supernatural territorial assertion and dynasty-level elimination campaigns. The psychological warfare sophistication that advanced entity capabilities demonstrated included systematic exploitation of individual family member vulnerabilities, while personalized supernatural manifestations exceeded normal spiritual communication through intimate knowledge of personal history and emotional trauma patterns, whose accuracy suggested otherworldly intelligence gathering and strategic psychological analysis. The sophistication included tactical coordination across multiple simultaneous operations, while entity psychological manipulation techniques enabled virtual certainty of supernatural trap success through calculated rather than accidental vulnerability exploitation, whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual encounter through strategic rather than random predatory targeting. The territorial sovereignty assertion that characterized supernatural entity long-term objectives included systematic elimination of pioneer settlement, whose success would restore pre-European spiritual territorial conditions, while ongoing dynasty-level elimination campaigns served territorial reclamation, rather than purely predatory satisfaction through comprehensive rather than selective human elimination, whose scope encompassed all bloodlines associated with territorial violation and sacred site desecration. The assertion included establishment of supernatural territorial control, while entity strategic objectives transcended individual family elimination to encompass regional territorial sovereignty restoration, whose achievement required ongoing supernatural vigilance and systematic human elimination through dynasty-level targeting and multi-generational persecution whose persistence would exceed individual entity operational lifetime. As Dr. Ezekiel Morrison's systematic documentation revealed statistical impossibility of coordinated supernatural persecution affecting 7 interconnected pioneer families whose territorial settlement activities shared participation in Cherokee sacred site desecration and territorial sovereignty violation. The intelligent supernatural entity that emerged along Devil's Promenade had demonstrated sophisticated psychological warfare capabilities whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual manifestation through strategic dynasty-level elimination campaigns, whose scope transcended individual encounters to encompass comprehensive bloodline targeting and multi-generational persecution whose success would restore spiritual territorial sovereignty through systematic elimination of human settlement, whose achievement required ongoing supernatural territorial assertion and calculated psychological manipulation designed to exploit specific family vulnerabilities and ancestral guilt regarding participation in cultural genocide and sacred site violation. The systematic pattern recognition that Sarah Blackwood achieved through 28 years of survival within targeted bloodline included comprehensive understanding of supernatural entity, multi-generational persecution, whose characteristics exceeded normal spiritual encounter through strategic rather than random family targeting, whose scope encompassed 3 generations of systematic dynasty elimination attempts. Her investigation revealed entity demonstration of otherworldly memory capabilities, whose persistence exceeded normal spiritual manifestation duration, while supernatural intelligence enabled ongoing tactical adaptation and strategic refinement, whose effectiveness transcended individual encounters through comprehensive rather than episodic family persecution, whose success required intimate knowledge of bloodline history and individual psychological vulnerabilities. Captain James Reed's military investigation into territorial boundary supernatural phenomena included systematic analysis of disappearance reports whose patterns exceeded normal frontier violence through coordinated rather than random targeting, whose characteristics suggested otherworldly intelligence and strategic planning that challenged conventional military threat assessment frameworks. His 45 years of military experience provided professional background for recognizing tactical coordination, while supernatural entity operational capabilities exceeded normal human intelligence gathering through otherworldly rather than purely material surveillance and reconnaissance, whose effectiveness enabled comprehensive territorial control and systematic dynasty elimination, whose success threatened regional settlement stability and territorial security. The multi-generational targeting evidence that Sarah's investigation revealed included supernatural entity knowledge of family historical details spanning multiple generations, while manifestations demonstrated intimate understanding of ancestral participation in Cherokee displacement and sacred site violation, whose accuracy exceeded normal spiritual communication through otherworldly rather than purely individual memory preservation. The evidence included specific references to deceased relatives and family secrets, while supernatural entity psychological manipulation exploited inherited guilt and ancestral responsibility for territorial dispossession, whose acknowledgement created optimal vulnerability for supernatural elimination through calculated rather than accidental psychological warfare, whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual encounter. The territorial boundary significance that Captain Reed's military analysis revealed included strategic importance of Devil's Promenade location, whose geographic position enabled optimal supernatural territorial assertion, while Entity Operational Base provided comprehensive regional surveillance and tactical positioning, whose effectiveness exceeded normal territorial control through otherworldly, rather than purely physical advantages. The significance included international boundary implications, while supernatural territorial claims challenged official governmental territorial sovereignty through indigenous spiritual authority, whose legitimacy predated European territorial claiming and required ongoing acknowledgement of sacred site protection and traditional territorial management protocols. The psychological warfare escalation that characterized advancing supernatural threat included systematic deployment of enhanced manipulation techniques whose effectiveness exceeded previous manifestation through entity learning capabilities and tactical adaptation based on family response patterns whose analysis enabled optimal vulnerability exploitation. The escalation included comprehensive psychological profile development, while entity understanding of human psychology enabled creation of virtually irresistible supernatural traps whose success rate exceeded normal spiritual manipulation through strategic rather than accidental psychological warfare, whose sophistication transcended normal supernatural entity capabilities through ongoing tactical refinement. The ancestral guilt exploitation that supernatural entity psychological warfare utilized included systematic deployment of Cherokee spiritual imagery and ceremonial references whose accuracy exceeded normal spiritual knowledge, while manifestations included specific details about family participation in territorial dispossession and cultural genocide, whose acknowledgement created psychological vulnerability that facilitated supernatural elimination. The exploitation included inherited trauma activation, while entity understanding of intergenerational psychological impact enabled optimal guilt manipulation, whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual communication through calculated rather than accidental psychological targeting, whose success created optimal conditions for supernatural elimination through emotional rather than physical vulnerability exploitation. The family secret revelation that demonstrated supernatural entity intelligence included manifestations that referenced intimate family knowledge whose accuracy exceeded normal spiritual communication, while entity access to historical information suggested other-worldly intelligence gathering capabilities that transcended temporal limitations and enabled comprehensive family psychological analysis. The revelations included specific details about deceased relatives and family history, while supernatural entity knowledge of individual psychological weaknesses enabled optimal manipulation strategy development, whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual encounter through strategic rather than random psychological warfare, whose success facilitated systematic dynasty elimination. The territorial claiming consequence analysis that characterized supernatural entity targeting criteria revealed systematic persecution of families whose settlement activities included direct participation in Cherokee sacred site violation and commercial exploitation of dispossessed indigenous territories, whose spiritual consequences exceeded normal environmental disruption through systematic spiritual territorial sovereignty violation. The analysis included identification of specific burial ground desecration, while entity targeting criteria encompassed territorial claiming activities whose spiritual implications required ongoing acknowledgement of indigenous territorial authority, whose violation justified supernatural territorial assertion and dynasty elimination through calculated rather than random supernatural persecution. The defensive strategy inadequacy that surviving family members discovered included systematic failure of traditional protective techniques whose effectiveness proved insufficient against supernatural entity intelligence, and tactical adaptation whose sophistication exceeded normal spiritual manifestation through strategic rather than instinctual supernatural capabilities. The inadequacy included religious protective measure circumvention, while entity tactical learning enabled systematic countermeasure development against human defensive techniques, whose limitation revealed need for innovative rather than conventional protective approaches, whose effectiveness required understanding of supernatural entity, psychological warfare, and strategic objectives whose achievement transcended individual elimination to encompass comprehensive dynasty destruction. The bloodline tracking capability that supernatural entity demonstrated included systematic identification of family descendants across geographical distances, while supernatural reconnaissance exceeded normal spiritual manifestation through otherworldly rather than purely physical surveillance, whose effectiveness enabled ongoing persecution despite family relocation attempts. The capability included genetic spiritual connection exploitation, while entity supernatural abilities enabled descendant identification whose accuracy exceeded normal spiritual communication through otherworldly rather than purely individual intelligence, whose operational scope transcended territorial limitations and enabled comprehensive dynasty targeting whose persistence exceeded normal spiritual encounter duration. The territorial expansion evidence that characterized supernatural entity operational development included systematic claiming of additional geographical regions, while influence expansion exceeded original Devil's Promenade location through strategic rather than opportunistic territorial control, whose scope suggested long-term rather than temporary supernatural objectives. The expansion included coordination with other supernatural entities, while territorial control enhancement enabled comprehensive regional surveillance and tactical positioning, whose effectiveness exceeded individual entity capabilities through collective rather than purely individual supernatural coordination, whose success facilitated ongoing dynasty elimination and territorial assertion. The psychological manipulation sophistication that advanced supernatural threat demonstrated included systematic exploitation of individual family member psychology, while personalized supernatural manifestations exceeded normal spiritual communication through intimate knowledge of personal trauma and emotional vulnerability, whose accuracy suggested otherworldly psychological analysis capabilities. The sophistication included tactical coordination across simultaneous operations, while entity understanding of human psychology enabled virtual certainty of supernatural trap success through calculated rather than accidental vulnerability exploitation, whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual encounter through strategic psychological warfare, whose success facilitated comprehensive dynasty elimination. The regional threat assessment that Captain Reed's military investigation provided included recognition that supernatural entity capabilities exceeded individual family persecution through coordinated territorial control and systematic dynasty elimination, whose scope threatened broader settlement stability and territorial security through ongoing supernatural warfare against pioneer communities. The assessment included strategic threat analysis, while supernatural entity operational capabilities suggested evolution from individual manifestation toward regional supernatural authority, whose territorial claims challenged governmental sovereignty and required innovative rather than conventional military response, whose effectiveness demanded understanding of supernatural rather than purely human tactical capabilities. The inherited vulnerability pattern that Sarah's investigation revealed included systematic targeting of family descendants whose persecution characteristics suggested genetic spiritual connection exploitation, while supernatural entity ability to identify bloodline members exceeded normal spiritual manifestation through otherworldly rather than purely individual intelligence, whose accuracy enabled ongoing multi-generational targeting. The pattern included psychological trauma inheritance, while family history exploitation created optimal vulnerability conditions, whose recognition enabled supernatural elimination through calculated rather than accidental psychological manipulation, whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual encounter through strategic rather than random family targeting. The territorial sovereignty challenge that supernatural entity operations represented included systematic assertion of indigenous spiritual authority over traditional territorial boundaries, while dynasty elimination campaigns served territorial reclamation rather than purely predatory objectives, whose achievement required comprehensive rather than selective human elimination. The challenge included governmental authority circumvention, while supernatural territorial claims operated according to indigenous spiritual sovereignty, whose legitimacy predated European territorial claiming and required acknowledgement of traditional territorial management protocols, whose violation justified ongoing supernatural territorial assertion and dynasty elimination, whose success would restore pre-European spiritual territorial conditions. The strategic intelligence demonstration that characterized supernatural entity advanced capabilities included systematic understanding of human military organization and governmental territorial authority, while tactical knowledge enabled optimal countermeasure development against conventional defensive responses, whose inadequacy revealed supernatural entity sophistication that exceeded normal spiritual manifestation through strategic rather than instinctual intelligence, whose operational effectiveness transcended individual entity limitations through collective supernatural coordination and territorial control, whose scope challenged contemporary understanding of supernatural entity capabilities and territorial authority, whose acknowledgement required innovative rather than conventional protective approaches. As Sarah Blackwood's investigation revealed, multi-generational supernatural persecution patterns whose scope exceeded individual family targeting through strategic dynasty elimination campaigns, while Captain Reed's military analysis documented territorial boundary supernatural phenomena whose characteristics challenged conventional threat assessment through otherworldly intelligence and tactical coordination. The supernatural entity that operated along Devil's Promenade had demonstrated sophisticated psychological warfare capabilities whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual manifestation through comprehensive bloodline targeting and ancestral guilt exploitation, whose success facilitated systematic territorial assertion and indigenous spiritual sovereignty restoration through calculated elimination of pioneer families whose settlement activities violated Cherokee sacred sites and traditional territorial protection requirements, whose ongoing acknowledgement demanded respectful coexistence rather than systematic territorial domination through cultural displacement and sacred site desecration. The systematic dynasty elimination campaign that reached peak effectiveness during 1850-1858 period included supernatural entity coordination whose scope encompassed comprehensive territorial control, while 6 of 7 targeted family bloodlines approached complete extinction through coordinated supernatural warfare, whose sophistication exceeded normal spiritual manifestation through strategic, rather than individual predatory activity. The surviving family members' recognition that they confronted otherworldly intelligence, whose objectives transcended normal territorial assertion, created acknowledgement that supernatural threat exceeded individual encounter significance through systematic multi-generational persecution, whose scope suggested ancient spiritual authority and territorial sovereignty, claims whose legitimacy predated European settlement and required ongoing, respectful acknowledgement. Running Bear's elderly spiritual authority provided crucial understanding of supernatural entity transformation from territorial guardian into corrupted, vengeful predator, whose evolution resulted from systematic cultural trauma and spiritual desecration exposure, whose cumulative effects exceeded normal environmental disruption through massive territorial sovereignty violation and sacred site destruction. His traditional knowledge encompassed understanding of territorial guardian spirits, whose protective function included sacred site maintenance, while exposure to cultural genocide and territorial dispossession had corrupted protective instincts into vengeful dynasty elimination, whose targeting included direct participants in territorial violation and systematic cultural destruction through settlement activities that ignored indigenous spiritual sovereignty and traditional territorial management protocols. The territorial guardian corruption mechanism that Cherokee spiritual knowledge revealed included systematic transformation of protective spirits through exposure to massive cultural trauma whose intensity exceeded normal environmental disruption, while territorial sovereignty violation and sacred site desecration created conditions where ancient spiritual forces abandoned traditional protective function to pursue supernatural vengeance against specific bloodlines, whose settlement activities represented ongoing cultural warfare and territorial dispossession. The corruption included psychological modification, while spiritual contamination through genocidal exposure transformed guardian instincts into predatory dynasty elimination, whose persistence exceeded normal spiritual encounter duration through otherworldly rather than temporal intelligence preservation and tactical capability enhancement. The bloodline tracking sophistication that supernatural entity demonstrated included systematic descendant identification across vast geographical distances, while genetic spiritual connection exploitation enabled ongoing persecution despite family relocation attempts, whose effectiveness exceeded normal territorial limitations through otherworldly rather than purely physical surveillance. Capabilities. The tracking included inherited memory exploitation, while entity supernatural abilities enabled psychological manipulation through genetic spiritual bonds, whose accuracy exceeded normal spiritual communication through otherworldly intelligence gathering, whose effectiveness transcended temporal limitations and enabled comprehensive dynasty targeting, whose persistence required strategic rather than accidental supernatural coordination. The coordinated territorial attacks that characterized peak supernatural threat included systematic, simultaneous manifestations across multiple geographical regions, while entity operational capabilities exceeded individual territorial control through collective supernatural coordination, whose effectiveness suggested hierarchical organization and strategic command structure that transcended normal spiritual manifestation limitations. The attacks included real-time tactical adaptation, while supernatural communication enabled comprehensive territorial coverage, whose scope exceeded normal entity capabilities through collective rather than purely individual supernatural intelligence, whose coordination facilitated systematic dynasty elimination and territorial assertion, whose success required ongoing strategic planning and tactical refinement. The defensive strategy failure documentation that surviving family members experienced included systematic inadequacy of traditional protective techniques, whose effectiveness proved insufficient against supernatural entity intelligence, and tactical adaptation, whose sophistication exceeded normal spiritual manifestation through strategic rather than instinctual capabilities enhancement. The failures included religious protective measure, circumvention, while entity learning capabilities enabled systematic countermeasure development, whose success eliminated conventional defensive options and required innovative, rather than traditional protective approaches, whose effectiveness demanded understanding of supernatural entity, psychological warfare, and strategic objectives, whose achievement transcended individual family elimination. The family identity concealment attempts that surviving bloodlines employed included systematic name changes and geographical relocation, whose effectiveness proved inadequate against supernatural entity tracking capabilities, whose sophistication exceeded normal territorial limitations through otherworldly rather than purely physical surveillance, whose accuracy enabled ongoing persecution despite human defensive measures. The concealment included genealogical record destruction, while entity supernatural abilities transcended normal information sources through genetic spiritual connection exploitation, whose effectiveness exceeded conventional hiding techniques and required acknowledgement of supernatural rather than purely human tracking capabilities, whose limitation demanded innovative protective approaches. The psychological manipulation evolution that advanced supernatural threat demonstrated included systematic refinement of tactical approaches whose effectiveness exceeded original manifestation through entity learning capabilities and strategic adaptation based on family response patterns, whose analysis enabled optimal vulnerability exploitation. The evolution included personalized supernatural trap creation, while entity understanding of human psychology facilitated virtual certainty of manipulation, success through calculated rather than accidental psychological warfare, whose sophistication transcended normal spiritual encounter through strategic intelligence and tactical coordination, whose effectiveness exceeded individual entity capabilities through collective supernatural enhancement. The territorial expansion coordination that characterized regional supernatural threat included systematic claiming of additional geographical areas, while entity influence exceeded original Devil's Promenade location through strategic rather than opportunistic territorial control, whose scope suggested long-term supernatural objectives that transcended individual dynasty elimination to encompass comprehensive regional territorial sovereignty restoration. The expansion included coordination with other supernatural entities, while collective territorial authority enabled enhanced surveillance and tactical positioning, whose effectiveness exceeded individual capabilities through supernatural rather than purely individual intelligence, whose operational scope challenged governmental territorial sovereignty and required innovative protective responses. The inherited trauma exploitation that supernatural entity psychological warfare utilized included systematic activation of genetic spiritual memories whose accuracy exceeded normal spiritual communication, while ancestral guilt manipulation enabled optimal vulnerability creation through inherited responsibility for territorial dispossession and cultural genocide participation. The exploitation included family secret revelation, while entity knowledge of intergenerational psychological impact enabled strategic guilt deployment, whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual manipulation through calculated rather than accidental emotional vulnerability exploitation, whose success facilitated systematic dynasty elimination through psychological rather than purely physical supernatural assault. The cultural genocide consequence analysis that characterized supernatural entity motivation revealed systematic targeting of families whose settlement activities represented ongoing cultural warfare against indigenous populations, while dynasty elimination served territorial reclamation rather than purely predatory objectives whose achievement required comprehensive rather than selective human elimination. The analysis included recognition of supernatural entity legitimate territorial claims, while indigenous spiritual authority predated European settlement and required acknowledgement of traditional territorial management, whose violation justified ongoing supernatural territorial assertion and dynasty elimination, whose success would restore pre-European spiritual territorial conditions. The spiritual corruption evidence that Running Bear's traditional knowledge provided included understanding of protective spirit transformation through massive trauma exposure, while systematic cultural destruction and territorial sovereignty violation created conditions where ancient guardian entities abandoned protective function to pursue supernatural vengeance against specific bloodlines whose activities represented ongoing territorial dispossession and sacred site violation. The corruption included psychological modification, while spiritual contamination through genocidal exposure enabled enhanced supernatural capabilities whose tactical deployment exceeded normal spiritual manifestation through otherworldly rather than purely individual intelligence enhancement. The survivor psychological trauma that characterized final family members included systematic recognition of supernatural entity sophistication, whose capabilities exceeded normal spiritual encounter through strategic intelligence and tactical coordination that challenged contemporary understanding of supernatural threat assessment and defensive preparation. The trauma included inherited guilt activation, while ancestral responsibility acknowledgement created psychological vulnerability, whose exploitation enabled supernatural elimination through emotional rather than physical assault, whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual manipulation through calculated psychological warfare, whose success facilitated ongoing dynasty elimination campaigns. The territorial sovereignty restoration that supernatural entity long-term objectives encompassed included systematic elimination of pioneer settlement, whose success would re-establish indigenous spiritual authority over traditional territorial boundaries, while dynasty elimination campaigns served comprehensive territorial reclamation rather than purely individual predatory satisfaction. The restoration included sacred site protection, while spiritual territorial sovereignty required ongoing respectful acknowledgement of indigenous territorial claims, whose violation justified supernatural territorial assertion and human elimination, whose persistence would exceed individual entity operational lifetime through otherworldly rather than temporal intelligence preservation. The regional supernatural authority that entity territorial expansion suggested included evolution from individual manifestation toward comprehensive territorial control, whose scope exceeded normal spiritual entity capabilities through collective supernatural coordination and strategic territorial claiming, whose effectiveness challenged governmental sovereignty and required acknowledgement of indigenous spiritual territorial rights. The authority included hierarchical supernatural organization, while territorial claiming activities operated according to traditional indigenous sovereignty, whose legitimacy predated European settlement and required ongoing respectful coexistence rather than systematic territorial domination, whose continuation would justify enhanced supernatural territorial assertion and dynasty elimination, whose success would restore traditional spiritual territorial balance. The final elimination preparation that characterized supernatural entity peak capabilities included systematic coordination of remaining bloodline targeting, while enhanced psychological warfare and tactical sophistication exceeded previous manifestation through strategic rather than random supernatural deployment, whose effectiveness would determine ongoing territorial sovereignty and spiritual authority over contested borderland regions. The preparation included comprehensive vulnerability analysis, while entity strategic planning encompassed definitive dynasty elimination, whose success would complete territorial reclamation objectives and establish permanent supernatural territorial control, whose maintenance required ongoing vigilance against future territorial violation and sacred site desecration through settlement activities that ignored indigenous spiritual sovereignty and traditional territorial management protocols. As the supernatural entity that operated along Devil's Promenade achieved peak bloodline hunting effectiveness, while 6 of 7 targeted pioneer dynasties approached complete extinction through coordinated supernatural warfare whose sophistication exceeded normal spiritual manifestation. Running Bear's Cherokee spiritual knowledge revealed entity transformation from territorial guardian into corrupted, vengeful predator, whose evolution resulted from systematic cultural trauma exposure and territorial sovereignty violation, while surviving family members confronted otherworldly intelligence, whose strategic objectives encompassed comprehensive dynasty elimination and indigenous spiritual territorial sovereignty restoration, whose success would challenge European settlement territorial claims and require acknowledgement of traditional territorial management protocols, whose violation had created conditions for supernatural territorial assertion and systematic human elimination through calculated psychological warfare and multi-generational persecution, whose persistence transcended normal spiritual encounter duration. The desperate final intervention that Sarah Blackwood initiated through collaboration with Running Bear represented unprecedented attempt at supernatural territorial conflict resolution, whose success required systematic integration of Cherokee ceremonial knowledge with pioneer community acknowledgement of historical injustice and ancestral responsibility for territorial dispossession and cultural genocide participation, whose recognition might enable spiritual entity transformation from vengeful dynasty destroyer back toward traditional protective guardian function. The 80-year-old Cherokee Elder's spiritual authority provided crucial understanding of territorial guardian restoration procedures, while traditional ceremonial knowledge encompassed appropriate protocols for redirecting corrupted spiritual energy, whose transformation required genuine rather than performative acknowledgement of territorial injustice and sacred site violation. The spiritual intervention methodology that Cherokee ceremonial tradition provided included systematic restoration procedures whose effectiveness required acknowledgement of legitimate indigenous territorial sovereignty, while sacred site restoration demanded comprehensive rather than superficial recognition of spiritual territorial claims, whose violation had created optimal conditions for protective spirit corruption and dynasty elimination campaigns. The methodology included traditional purification ceremonies, while spiritual energy redirection required genuine restitution rather than merely symbolic gesture, whose authenticity would determine supernatural entity response to attempted territorial conflict resolution through restoration rather than continued supernatural warfare against remaining pioneer bloodlines. The corrupted spiritual energy analysis that Running Bear's traditional knowledge revealed included understanding of territorial guardian transformation through systematic cultural trauma exposure, while massive territorial sovereignty violation and sacred site desecration had perverted protective spiritual function into vengeful supernatural predation, whose targeting included specific bloodlines associated with territorial dispossession and cultural destruction. The analysis included spiritual contamination mechanisms, while otherworldly entity corruption exceeded normal environmental disruption through exposure to genocidal territorial policies, whose implementation had systematically violated spiritual territorial sovereignty and sacred site protection requirements, whose maintenance demanded ongoing respectful acknowledgement. The historical injustice acknowledgement that spiritual intervention required included systematic recognition of pioneer family participation in Cherokee territorial dispossession and sacred site violation, whose consequences exceeded normal settlement impact through direct involvement in cultural genocide and territorial sovereignty destruction, whose spiritual implications created optimal conditions for supernatural territorial assertion and dynasty elimination. The acknowledgement included ancestral responsibility, acceptance, while inherited guilt recognition demanded genuine rather than superficial understanding of territorial injustice and cultural destruction, whose ongoing consequences required comprehensive restitution and respectful territorial relationship establishment, whose maintenance would prevent future supernatural corruption. The territorial restitution requirements that spiritual restoration demanded included systematic sacred site protection and ongoing respectful acknowledgement of indigenous territorial sovereignty, whose implementation exceeded symbolic gesture to encompass genuine behavioral modification and territorial relationship restructuring based on traditional rather than European territorial management principles. The restitution included economic compensation, while territorial access required ongoing Cherokee spiritual oversight and appropriate ceremonial maintenance, whose effectiveness would depend upon authentic rather than performative commitment to respectful territorial coexistence, whose violation might justify renewed supernatural territorial assertion and dynasty elimination campaigns. The spiritual transformation process that ceremonial intervention enabled included systematic redirection of corrupted supernatural energy from vengeful dynasty elimination toward traditional protective guardian function, whose restoration required comprehensive rather than partial territorial conflict resolution through genuine acknowledgement of historical injustice and ongoing commitment to respectful territorial coexistence. The transformation included supernatural entity psychological modification, while spiritual energy purification demanded authentic rather than manipulative territorial relationship establishment, whose maintenance would prevent future spiritual corruption through ongoing respectful acknowledgement of indigenous territorial sovereignty and sacred site protection requirements. The pioneer community resistance that spiritual intervention encountered included systematic reluctance to acknowledge ancestral participation in territorial injustice, while economic and social costs of genuine restitution created optimal conditions for continued supernatural territorial conflict, whose escalation would result in complete remaining bloodline elimination through enhanced dynasty hunting campaigns. The resistance included psychological denial, while inherited privilege protection created obstacles to authentic territorial justice, whose implementation required fundamental rather than superficial behavioral modification and territorial relationship restructuring, whose acceptance challenged contemporary pioneer cultural assumptions about appropriate territorial sovereignty and indigenous rights. Acknowledgement. The authentic responsibility acceptance that Sarah Blackwood demonstrated included systematic recognition of family participation in Cherokee territorial dispossession, while genuine rather than performative guilt acknowledgement enabled spiritual intervention effectiveness through authentic rather than manipulative territorial relationship establishment, whose maintenance required ongoing commitment to respectful territorial coexistence and sacred site protection. Her acceptance included economic sacrifice, while territorial relationship restructuring demanded comprehensive rather than selective behavioral modification, whose authenticity would determine supernatural entity response to attempted spiritual transformation from vengeful predator toward traditional protective guardian, whose restoration required genuine territorial justice implementation. The ceremonial restoration procedures that Cherokee spiritual tradition encompassed included systematic purification rituals, and sacred site blessing, whose effectiveness required authentic, rather than superficial territorial relationship establishment, while spiritual energy redirection demanded ongoing commitment to respectful territorial coexistence, whose maintenance would prevent future supernatural corruption. The procedures included traditional spiritual authority acknowledgement, while ceremonial effectiveness required genuine rather than performative understanding of territorial justice, whose implementation exceeded symbolic gesture to encompass comprehensive territorial relationship restructuring based on indigenous rather than European territorial management principles. The supernatural entity transformation that successful spiritual intervention achieved included systematic redirection of corrupted spiritual energy from vengeful dynasty elimination toward traditional protective territorial guardian function, whose restoration required ongoing, rather than temporary commitment to respectful territorial coexistence and sacred site protection. The transformation included psychological modification, while spiritual energy purification enabled return to original protective function, whose maintenance required authentic, rather than manipulative territorial relationship establishment, whose violation might justify renewed supernatural territorial assertion, but whose respectful maintenance would prevent future spiritual corruption and dynasty elimination campaigns. The territorial protection function restoration that characterized successful spiritual intervention included supernatural entity return to traditional guardian role, whose protective activities would encompass sacred site maintenance and territorial sovereignty protection through ongoing vigilance rather than systematic human elimination whose necessity had been created through territorial sovereignty violation and cultural destruction. The restoration included environmental protection, while territorial guardian function required ongoing respectful acknowledgement of indigenous spiritual authority, whose maintenance would prevent future supernatural corruption through authentic rather than performative territorial relationship establishment and sacred site protection, whose implementation exceeded symbolic gesture. The ongoing spiritual protocol establishment that characterized territorial conflict resolution included systematic procedures for maintaining respectful territorial coexistence while preventing future supernatural corruption through authentic acknowledgement of indigenous territorial sovereignty and sacred site protection requirements whose violation might justify renewed spiritual territorial assertion and dynasty elimination. The protocols included regular ceremonial maintenance, while territorial relationship management required ongoing Cherokee spiritual oversight, whose effectiveness would depend upon authentic rather than manipulative commitment to territorial justice, whose implementation demanded comprehensive rather than selective behavioral modification and territorial relationship restructuring. The preventive spiritual maintenance that territorial conflict resolution established included systematic sacred site protection and ongoing ceremonial observance, whose effectiveness required authentic rather than superficial commitment to respectful territorial coexistence, while territorial relationship management demanded comprehensive understanding of indigenous spiritual sovereignty whose acknowledgement would prevent future supernatural corruption. The maintenance included regular spiritual oversight, while territorial protection required ongoing community commitment to territorial justice, whose implementation exceeded symbolic gesture to encompass genuine behavioral modification and territorial relationship restructuring, whose authenticity would determine long-term territorial conflict prevention and spiritual guardian function maintenance. The territorial justice implementation that successful spiritual intervention required included systematic recognition of indigenous territorial sovereignty, while sacred site protection demanded ongoing rather than temporary commitment to respectful territorial coexistence, whose maintenance would prevent future supernatural corruption through authentic rather than performative territorial relationship establishment. The implementation included economic restitution, while territorial access required Cherokee spiritual oversight, whose effectiveness would depend upon genuine rather than manipulative commitment to territorial justice, whose violation might justify renewed supernatural territorial assertion, but whose respectful maintenance would ensure ongoing peaceful territorial coexistence and spiritual guardian function preservation. The community education establishment the territorial conflict resolution encompassed included systematic preservation of traditional knowledge about respectful territorial coexistence, while future generation education would prevent territorial sovereignty violation and sacred site desecration, whose consequences might justify supernatural territorial assertion and dynasty elimination campaigns. The education included Cherokee spiritual tradition acknowledgement, while territorial relationship understanding required ongoing cultural exchange and mutual respect, whose maintenance would prevent future territorial conflict through authentic rather than superficial understanding of indigenous territorial rights and spiritual sovereignty, whose violation had created optimal conditions for supernatural territorial assertion and systematic dynasty elimination through corrupted guardian spirit transformation. The spiritual balance restoration that characterized successful territorial conflict resolution included systematic establishment of appropriate territorial relationship between pioneer settlement and indigenous spiritual sovereignty, while respectful coexistence enabled supernatural entity return to traditional protective function, whose maintenance required ongoing acknowledgement of territorial justice and sacred site protection. The balance included environmental protection, while territorial harmony demanded authentic rather than performative commitment to territorial coexistence, whose violation would justify supernatural territorial assertion, but whose respectful maintenance would ensure ongoing peaceful territorial relationship and spiritual guardian function, whose protective activities would encompass territorial sovereignty protection rather than systematic human elimination, whose necessity had been eliminated through genuine territorial justice implementation and authentic acknowledgement of historical injustice. As Sarah Blackwood's collaboration with Running Bear achieved successful spiritual intervention, whose effectiveness required genuine acknowledgement of ancestral participation in Cherokee territorial dispossession, while authentic territorial justice implementation enabled supernatural entity transformation from vengeful dynasty destroyer back toward traditional protective guardian function. The territorial conflict resolution had established ongoing spiritual protocols for respectful territorial coexistence, whose maintenance would prevent future supernatural corruption through authentic rather than performative commitment to indigenous territorial sovereignty, acknowledgement, and sacred site protection, whose violation might justify renewed spiritual territorial assertion, but whose respectful maintenance would ensure peaceful territorial relationship and spiritual balance, whose restoration encompassed comprehensive territorial justice, implementation, and ongoing respectful acknowledgement of traditional territorial management principles, whose authenticity would determine long-term territorial harmony and spiritual guardian function preservation rather than continued dynasty elimination campaigns.